They say every painting tells a story, but some stories never get a chance to be heard. On a crisp evening in Santa Fe, the kind of night where the desert sky looks close enough to touch, the city's art elite gathered at the historic Granada Hall for a veterans' charity auction. There were diamonds flashing under the lights, the low hum of old money and conversation, and a string quartet rehearsing the same soft notes on the balcony. Outside, an old man stood quietly in the shadow of the marbled entrance. His name was Warren Graham, but to most, he was just Dusty. 77 years old, but he carried himself like a man who'd long ago stopped caring what other people thought. He wore an old bomber jacket, faded by sun and years, over a pair of khakis and well-worn boots. His hands were rough, knuckles scarred, and his eyes had that faraway look people get when they've seen too much. Dusty checked the invitation one more time. Simple, elegant, his name printed in gold. In recognition of your service, we invite you to the annual Fallen Heroes Art Gala. Black tie. Dusty shrugged, adjusted the jacket. The jacket was the only black tie he'd ever cared about. He stepped forward, boots echoing on the polished flagstones. As he reached for the door, a young woman in a shimmering silver dress intercepted him with a practiced smile. Miranda, the hostess, held a clipboard close to her chest. She scanned him up and down. Old jacket, threadbare khakis, a face the years had been hard on. "Excuse me, sir," she said, voice crisp as winter. "Deliveries go around back. This is a private event." Dusty paused, holding out his invitation, keeping his voice low. "Not delivering anything, ma'am? I'm here for the gala." Miranda barely glanced at the invitation. "These are for invited guests?" she insisted, her tone turning sharper. As she gestured toward the line of luxury cars pulling up at the curb, valets rushing to open doors, guests stepping out in tuxedos and evening gowns. Dusty watched them for a moment, quiet. "It says right there. Warren Graham." He tried again, tapping the card with a weathered finger. She arched a brow, unimpressed. "I'm sure there's been some mistake. This event has a strict dress code, military or formal attire only. We can't have people wandering in off the street, you understand?" Dusty's jaw tightened just a bit. He looked past her, at the grand hall glowing with light and laughter, and then down at his boots. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. A memory, maybe, or the sting of something that should have stopped hurting years ago. He nodded, tucked the invitation back in his jacket. "Didn't mean to cause trouble," he said quietly, and turned to leave. But someone was watching. Near the doorway, a young couple in dress blues exchanged uneasy glances, whispering to each other. The older bartender, polishing glasses inside, paused just long enough to frown in Miranda's direction, and inside, past the velvet rope, a pair of gray eyes locked onto the scene unfolding at the door. Miranda, still blocking the entrance, adjusted her clipboard, scanning the growing crowd. Another guest approached, this one tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a steady confidence that commanded attention even before his name was spoken. He wore the uniform of a full bird colonel, every medal precisely arranged, the Medal of Honor shining against the deep blue. Colonel Nathaniel Kane. The room seemed to hush when he walked in, a ripple of recognition following in his wake. He took one look at Miranda, then at Dusty's retreating back, and his face hardened. "Hold on," Kane called out, his voice booming above the music and conversation. Every head in the entryway turned. "That man, right there, dragged me out of a burning convoy in '72. He strode forward, boots clicking in rhythm, stopping directly between Miranda and Dusty. The entire lobby froze. Guests leaned in, whispers sweeping across the marble floor. Miranda's face turned the color of her silver dress. Kane snapped to attention, bringing his hand sharply to his brow in a salute, the kind only one soldier gives another. "Sergeant Warren Graham," he said, voice loud enough to echo off the ceiling, "belongs here more than anyone in this room." For a long moment, nobody moved. Dusty stood in place, eyes locked with Kane's, two men connected by things most people could never understand. Then, ever so slightly, Dusty nodded, accepting the salute, not as a hero, but as an old friend. The room, suddenly aware that something important was happening, began to fall silent. A couple of guests took off their hats instinctively. Miranda, flustered, stepped aside without another word, her clipboard shaking in her hands. Kane didn't wait for permission. He walked Dusty into the glowing heart of the gala, past the stairs and soft murmurs. As they passed under the crystal chandeliers, the string quartet stopped mid-note. The entire event, the art, the auction, the conversations about investments and legacy, seemed to fade away, replaced by the simple weight of a moment that belonged to two old soldiers and everyone now bearing witness. Dusty didn't look back at Miranda or the people still whispering. He kept his gaze straight ahead, shoulders squared, his old jacket fitting just right. In that instant, it was clear. Not all heroes wear ribbons and tuxedos. Some just show up when nobody expects them and remind the world what respect really means. A hush fell over the grand hall as Colonel Nathaniel Kane led Dusty into the glittering center of the event. Every eye was fixed on them, conversation fading to a hum and then to nothing at all. Crystal glasses hung suspended in mid-toast. A tray of hors d'oeuvres nearly tipped from a waiter's trembling hand. The only sound was the steady rhythm of Kane's boots against the mosaic tile, each step declaring that something extraordinary was happening. Miranda hovered near the door, cheeks blazing with embarrassment. She clung to her clipboard, desperate to blend into the wallpaper, but it was impossible to hide now. Word spread among the crowd, first in uncertain whispers, then with growing excitement, something about a medal of honor, a hero at the door, a story that demanded attention. Kane stopped at the center of the room, the spotlight cutting a golden path across his uniform and catching the shimmer of his medal of honor. He turned to face the crowd, his posture sharp and unyielding, voice resonant as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive me for interrupting your evening, but there's something you all need to know." He pointed to Dusty, still standing just behind him, his bomber jacket a striking contrast against the black tuxedos and elegant gowns. Kane's gaze swept the room, landing on the art collectors, the donors, the politicians who had come to sip champagne and celebrate the memory of heroes without expecting to meet one in the flesh. "That man right there," Kane announced, "is not just a guest tonight. He's the reason I'm standing here at all." The crowd leaned in, drawn by the gravity in Kane's tone. In 1972, in a place none of you would ever want to visit, our convoy was hit, fire everywhere, bullets coming down like rain, men screaming, I was trapped, burning, suffocating, sure it was over. He paused, letting the tension grow. The string quartet at the far end of the room set their instruments down, each musician turning to listen. Kane continued. Out of the smoke came Sergeant Warren Dusty Graham. He didn't hesitate. He didn't think about the bullets or the flames. He just came for me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some tried to imagine it, the chaos, the fear, the sheer audacity it would take to run toward danger for someone else. Most couldn't. Kane turned toward Dusty, emotion tightening his jaw. He pulled me out, dragged me 50 yards through fire and hell. I woke up in a field hospital, alive because of him. Alive because he put my life before his own. These, he gestured to the burn scars tracing the backs of Dusty's hands and creeping up his neck, aren't just decorations. Those are reminders of sacrifice, of courage. The silence in the room deepened, shifting from awkwardness to awe. Some guests removed their hats or bowed their heads, struck by the sudden realization that true heroism doesn't always come dressed for the occasion. Miranda, still at the edge of the hall, stared down at her trembling hands, the humiliation sharper than any reprimand. This was not the kind of mistake you could erase with an apology. A man in a navy suit stepped forward, his voice tentative. I didn't know, he stammered. I mean, we see uniforms, medals, on the news, or in parades, but... He trailed off, the words dying as Dusty lifted his head and finally met the man's eyes. Dusty's voice, when it came, was low, but steady. Most people don't know. And that's all right. We didn't do it for this. He glanced at the opulent chandeliers, the rich tapestries, the gleaming art on the walls. But sometimes it matters that someone remembers. The crowd began to shift, the sense of occasion transforming into something solemn, almost sacred. In the far corner, an older woman pressed a tissue to her eyes. A young army sergeant, there in full dress uniform, snapped to attention in silent salute. Kane reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded piece of yellowed paper. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded it, the creases well worn, the ink faded by decades. "I wrote this 50 years ago," he explained. "Told myself if I ever saw him again, I'd read it out loud." The room held its breath. Kane cleared his throat, voice raw and real. "Dear unknown Savior, if by some miracle you ever hear these words, know that you gave me more than my life that day. You gave me 50 years of birthdays, Christmas mornings, baseball games with my sons. You gave me the chance to become a better man. Because you showed me what real courage looks like. I pray I meet you again, if only to shake your hand and say, thank you. Nathaniel Kane." The note trembled in Kane's hand. A tear slid down his cheek, glinting in the ballroom light. All around him, men and women wiped their own eyes. Even the most stoic among them, the ones used to keeping emotion locked away, felt the sting of humility and gratitude. Dusty shifted awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. He glanced at Kane, then at the crowd, offering a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Didn't think I'd ever hear those words," he muttered. Kane grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Guess tonight's full of surprises, Sergeant." A ripple of applause started at the edge of the room and spread, tentative at first, then swelling into something thunderous. It wasn't the polite, routine clapping reserved for donors and dignitaries. It was the kind of applause that rises up for something true, something rare. And in the midst of it all, Dusty stood rooted to the spot, the only man in the room wishing the moment would pass. But for everyone else, it was a moment they'd never forget. A reminder that history lives among us, often unnoticed until the right story finds its voice. Underscore, 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 underscore. For a while after Kane finished reading his letter, the applause echoed around the grand hall like distant thunder. But as the clapping faded, so did the buzz of social chatter and the self-conscious laughter that had filled the room earlier. Now, a deep, reflective silence settled over the crowd. Even the crystal chandeliers, glittering above, seemed to cast a softer, gentler light. Dusty stood beside Colonel Kane, almost dazed by the shift in energy. He'd always tried to keep a low profile, to blend into the background, and now he was front and center, a reluctant witness to his own story. The Medal of Honor on Kane's chest seemed to glow, but it was Dusty's burns, the patches of pink and white scarring on his hands and neck that drew new attention. These were not decorations, but marks of pain, of sacrifice, of memory. The realization settled on the guests like a tangible weight. Kane broke the silence, his voice softer now, but no less commanding. "You all see these scars?" he asked, gesturing to Dusty's hands. "These aren't from some accident or a kitchen fire. They're from crawling through burning wreckage, pulling men out one by one. These are the marks of a man who never thought about glory, only about the guy next to him." As if in response, a few guests, old, young, uniformed, civilian, removed their hats, holding them over their hearts. The act was instinctive, as if paying respects at a gravesite. The string quartet in the corner quietly packed up their instruments, their music unnecessary now. The event had become something different, a kind of impromptu memorial, a reckoning with what the evening was truly meant to honor. Dusty shuffled his feet, uncomfortable in the silence and attention. He caught sight of Miranda, the hostess, standing near the door. Her shoulders had wilted, and her eyes were fixed on the floor. Her hands, usually steady and precise with a clipboard, now trembled slightly. It was the kind of humiliation that lingers, the kind that brings regret. Dusty glanced at her, then looked away, but Kane noticed. He walked over and gently guided Dusty a little deeper into the crowd. "Come on," Kane said quietly. "You shouldn't have to stand at the edge of your own story." As the two men walked, the crowd parted, almost reverently. People stepped aside, not out of deference to Kane's rank, but out of newfound respect for Dusty's quiet presence. Dusty caught snippets of hushed conversations. "Did you see his hands? He saved the colonel? That could have been any one of us." Near the buffet table, a young Marine in dress blues cleared his throat and offered a crisp salute. Dusty nodded in return, eyes flickering with understanding. At that moment, the event's auctioneer, a tall, silver-haired man named Roger Winslow, stepped to the microphone, his composure shaken. He tried to return to the planned program, but faltered. Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice unsteady, I think tonight has already become far more meaningful than any of us expected." A ripple of agreement passed through the crowd. Even the most jaded among them, those who'd come only for the art or the networking, found themselves reflecting on what true value really meant. In the far corner, Dusty found a quiet spot near a memorial display. A framed American flag, a pair of combat boots, and a black and white photo of a squadron. He let himself breathe for the first time since entering the building, taking in the memories. For him, each artifact was not just a symbol, but a piece of a life lived alongside brothers he could still hear laughing in the back of his mind. Colonel Kane joined him, the two men standing side by side without speaking. For a while, words were unnecessary. In the silence, Dusty closed his eyes, letting the memories wash over him, memories of heat, smoke, gunfire, and voices lost to time. Elsewhere, Miranda finally approached, her steps tentative. The humiliation of her mistake burned on her cheeks, but now she was driven by something deeper, a need to make amends. She stopped a few paces from Dusty and Kane, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Graham, I'm so sorry for how I treated you," she stammered. "I didn't know who you were, or what you'd done. There's no excuse for that." Dusty met her gaze, his expression gentle but resolute. "You were just doing your job," he replied quietly. "Most people don't see what's behind the uniform or the jacket." Miranda nodded, fighting tears. "I'll do better. I promise." Their exchange was brief, but something in the air shifted again. Awkwardness replaced by a growing sense of understanding. People who had watched Dusty's humiliation at the door now looked at him with new eyes. In their faces he saw not pity, but gratitude. Some stepped forward just to shake his hand, introducing themselves, offering small tokens of appreciation, a cup of coffee, a warm smile, a simple, "Thank you for your service." It was as if the whole room had been reminded all at once that history walks among us in battered jackets and worn-out boots, carrying stories worth more than any painting. Colonel Kane finally broke the silence with a steady hand on Dusty's shoulder. "You ready?" he asked. "For what?" Kane smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling with emotion. "For people to finally understand what this night is really about." Dusty nodded, a ghost of a smile crossing his lips. For the first time all evening, he felt seen, not as an intruder, but as a guest of honor. In the quiet that followed, the guests began to mingle again, but the tone had changed. The art on the walls seemed to shine a little brighter, the conversations grew softer, more sincere. It was as if the entire gala had taken a collective breath, realizing that true value can't be measured in dollars or applause, but in lives touched and sacrifices made. And in that room, beneath the desert sky, surrounded by art and memory, an old veteran in a bomber jacket became the measure of every story yet to be told. The gala regained a gentle hum, but the room was forever changed. The guests had grown quiet, their conversations tinted with the weight of what they'd witnessed. People glanced at Dusty with newfound respect, their previous assumptions about him melting away under the truth of his story. Yet, for all the admiration now swirling around him, Dusty remained rooted in the same spot, his hands clasped before him, gaze fixed on a painting across the room, a desert landscape eerily reminiscent of another place, another time. Colonel Nathaniel Kane noticed the shift, sensed the unsaid questions hanging in the air. He stood tall, straightening his jacket, then stepped forward, drawing the room's attention once again. "If you'll allow me, there's more to tell," he announced, his voice carrying across the hall. The crowd instinctively gathered closer, Their curiosity piqued. Kane turned to Dusty, nodding for permission. Dusty just shrugged, humble, almost embarrassed, and looked away, letting the colonel have the floor. Kane's eyes clouded as he began. Most of you know me as Colonel Kane. Some of you served with me, others only know the ribbons and stories. But very few know the real reason I made it home. He paused, searching the crowd, then locked eyes with a young man in a wheelchair near the stage. The real reason is standing right here. He took a breath, letting the memory pull him back half a century. It was 1972, in the central highlands of Vietnam. We were pinned down after an ambush. Our convoy torn apart, vehicles burning, chaos everywhere. I was hit. The smoke was so thick you couldn't see your own hands. The heat, God, the heat, felt like it was melting the flesh off my bones. I remember the screams, the gunfire, the sound of metal warping in the flames. Kane's hands trembled as he recounted the moment. He glanced at Dusty, searching his friend's scarred hands for reassurance, as if seeing those old wounds steadied him. He went on. I thought it was over. I was trapped, my leg caught under twisted steel. The flames were licking closer, and I could barely breathe. I tried to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. Just smoke, choking me from the inside out. The guests hung on every word, the opulence of the gala receding as the vividness of Kane's memory took over the room. And then, out of nowhere, Dusty appeared, Kane said, voice shaking but steady. I don't know how he made it through the bullets or the fire. He didn't pause, didn't hesitate. He crawled right through it all. I'll never forget the look on his face. Focused, determined, as if nothing in the world could stop him. A hush swept the room as Kane's story painted a scene far removed from the Santa Fe luxury, a world where life and death danced at the edge of every second. He got to me, said. Hold on, Colonel. I got you. And he meant it. I felt his hands on my shoulders, those same hands you see now, burned and battered. He pulled me out from under that wreck, dragging me on his back, while bullets cracked over our heads. The pain was unreal. I could barely see straight. But Dusty never faltered, never let go. A woman in the crowd covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Some of the veterans in attendance bowed their heads, transported by their own memories. Kane paused, voice thick with emotion. When we finally made it to the tree line, I thought I was dreaming. Dusty ripped off his own jacket to smother the flames on my back. He pressed his canteen to my lips. He kept talking, keeping me awake, telling me jokes about home, anything to keep my mind off the pain. That's what saved me. Not just the courage to go back into hell, but the heart to carry someone else's pain as his own. Dusty shifted uncomfortably, shrinking into himself. He looked away, pretending to study a painting on the far wall. Kane reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a folded, time-worn note. After that day, I wrote this letter. I told myself I'd read it aloud if I ever saw Dusty again. And tonight, after all these years, he paused, voice wavering. I want you all to hear it. He carefully unfolded the letter, hands shaking ever so slightly. He read, to the man who gave me 50 more years. My family, my second chance, my life. You taught me what real courage looks like. Not medals or speeches, but the kind of courage that steps into fire for a friend, no questions asked. I pray I become the kind of man worthy of your sacrifice. Thank you, Dusty. You saved more than my life. You saved my soul. As Kane finished, the silence was absolute. The only sound was the muffled sob of someone in the back row, echoing through the stillness. Dusty's eyes glistened as he stared at his feet, overwhelmed by a flood of memories and feelings he'd spent decades locking away. The applause that followed was slow, almost reverent, not the clapping of wealthy donors, but the salute of people recognizing greatness when it stood quietly among them. For a moment, Kane rested a hand on Dusty's shoulder. He didn't just fight, Kane said, his voice breaking through the crowd's emotion. He saved lives, mine included. I wouldn't be here, none of this would, if it weren't for him. A ripple of agreement and gratitude ran through the room. Even those who had never served, who had only heard stories of war secondhand, now saw the living, breathing cost and the quiet, enduring grace of real heroism. Roger Winslow, the auctioneer, approached, tears shining in his eyes. "We are honored tonight, more than words can say," he murmured, voice thick with respect. Across the hall, Miranda stood silently, her earlier embarrassment replaced with something deeper, humility and admiration. Dusty finally looked up, meeting the eyes of strangers who now saw him truly for the first time. The weight of the room's respect, the love in Kane's voice, and the unspoken gratitude in every face around him pressed on his heart until, for a moment, it was hard to breathe. He took a deep, steadying breath. For the first time in decades, he felt the possibility that his scars, his pain, might serve as more than a reminder of what was lost. They might be a symbol of what was saved. And all around him, under the shimmering lights and the memories of battles fought, people began to understand what it really meant to be a hero. The silence after Kane's words lingered, wrapping the room in a sense of awe that words couldn't quite touch. For a few heartbeats, the crowd seemed unsure what to do next, whether to applaud or to simply reflect on the depth of sacrifice that had unfolded before their eyes. The grand ballroom, with all its luxury and polished surfaces, felt transformed. The art on the walls seemed to fade, outshone by something far more precious. The living story embodied by Dusty in his battered jacket. Colonel Kane glanced at the stage, then back at Dusty, a spark of mischief, almost childlike, lighting up his battle-worn face. He strode to the auctioneer and took the microphone, his posture unwavering. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue with the scheduled lots, I propose we add a special item to tonight's auction." A wave of confusion swept the audience. Heads turned, whispers flew from table to table. Dusty shifted, uncertain. Kane gestured for attention. "Tonight," he announced, "we honor not only art, but the living spirit of service and sacrifice. So, with your permission, I'd like to start the auction with what I consider the most valuable artifact here, Sergeant Graham's jacket." The crowd gasped. Dusty recoiled instinctively, shaking his head. "It's not for sale," he said, voice rough, almost pleading. Kane put a reassuring hand on Dusty's shoulder, meeting his eyes. "Let them see, Dusty. Let them understand what honor really looks like." His voice was low, but carried the conviction of a man who knew the value of symbols, the power they held to change hearts. Dusty hesitated, torn between privacy and the possibility of something greater. He looked at the faces around him, veterans with silent tears in their eyes, young soldiers in awe, civilians now painfully aware of what they'd missed. With a trembling breath, he nodded. Slowly, Dusty began to unbutton the old bomber jacket. Each movement was deliberate, almost ceremonial. The room watched in rapt attention, the act feeling sacred. More than just removing a piece of clothing, but letting go of years of memory, pain, and pride. He slipped his arms out, folding the jacket as reverently as a flag. In that moment, the patches, the burn marks, the faded name tag, all became artifacts, fragments of a life lived in the margins of history. He walked up to the stage, every step echoing, and laid the jacket gently on the velvet-draped podium. For a long, quiet second, nobody moved. Roger Winslow, the auctioneer, found his voice. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said softly, his hands visibly shaking as he reached for the microphone. "We'll begin bidding at $1,000. The crowd was silent. Then, almost as if on cue, a woman in the third row raised her hand. "10,000, she called, her voice steady. Eyes locked on the jacket, a man in a tailored suit shot back, 50,000. Another voice, 100,000. The tension in the room was electric, the energy rising with each bid, but no one was smiling. The auction had become a ceremony, a chance for people to connect with something far bigger than themselves. Dusty stood off to the side, overwhelmed by the swirl of numbers. He tried to shrink from the attention, but Kane stood beside him, steady as a mountain. As the bidding climbed, Dusty's mind drifted. The jacket had been with him through everything: Vietnam, homecomings, funerals of friends, long nights alone with memory and regret. It was more than fabric, it was armor, and at times a shield against the world's indifference. Now he realized it was about to become something else. A symbol, a lesson, a legacy. The numbers jumped again. 200,000. 500,000. The crowd was no longer competing for ownership, but for the right to pay tribute, to honor what Dusty represented. The air was thick with emotion, the boundaries between stranger and friend dissolving. At 600,000, a hush fell. The final bidder was a woman in her early 30s, her voice clear and resolute. $600,000. My father served with Sergeant Graham. That jacket belongs in his memory case. All eyes turned to her. She stood, trembling, clutching a photograph. He spoke of you often. Said you were the bravest man he ever knew. Tears streaked down her face as she nodded to Dusty. I want my children to know your story. I want every veteran's child to know that sometimes the most important things aren't in textbooks or museums. They're in what we carry, and in what we leave behind. The applause that broke out was different from before, not for a victory, but for understanding, for healing, for the ways stories can leap from one generation to the next. Dusty looked at the woman, speechless, his own tears finally breaking free. For the first time, he felt the full weight of what it meant to be remembered, not as a relic, but as a living echo of every life he'd touched. Kane stepped forward, saluting Dusty one last time. You didn't just save me, Sergeant. Tonight, you saved all of us. From forgetting. Dusty, struggling to find his words, simply nodded, overcome by gratitude and awe. He realized now that his pain had become a bridge, one that could lead others home long after his own journey was done. And as the crowd rose in a standing ovation, Dusty's jacket on display, the ballroom was no longer just a place of art and money. It was a temple of memory, a testament to the quiet power of sacrifice and the enduring strength of a single, well-worn jacket. As the applause faded, the ballroom remained suspended in a reverent hush. Roger Winslow, the auctioneer, steadied himself behind the podium, hands still trembling from the emotional weight of the last few minutes. On the stage, Dusty's jacket rested on a velvet cushion, now bathed in the golden glow of a spotlight. Its battered fabric and faded patches transformed into something sacred before the eyes of all present. For many in the audience, the idea of a simple jacket commanding such attention was almost unthinkable. Until tonight. The jacket, ordinary to the untrained eye, now shimmered with meaning, carrying stories and sacrifice in every stitch. The energy in the room was electric. There was a sense that something momentous was unfolding, a ceremony that transcended the usual trappings of charity galas and black tie auctions. Roger cleared his throat, voice just a little hoarse. Ladies and gentlemen, the bidding for Sergeant Graham's jacket stands at $600,000. Do I hear $650? The woman in her 30s, who had made the last bid, sat with tears on her cheeks and a photo clutched in her hands. The image, visible to those nearby, showed her as a young girl sitting on her father's lap, a father whose memory was forever intertwined with the stories of men like Dusty Graham. She watched the stage with a look of profound longing and pride. A tall man in a navy blazer, clearly a successful businessman, raised his hand. $650,000, he called, voice determined. The bidding war reignited, but the competitive edge was gone. No one seemed interested in outshining anyone else. The room was united in the desire to honor what the jacket represented. 700, another woman offered, her accent marking her as a New Yorker. For my uncle, who never made it home. Each bid was less about acquisition and more about testimony, a pledge, a memory, a wish that these stories would never be forgotten. The tension in the room thickened, punctuated only by the gentle clinking of glasses and the soft shuffling of feet as guests leaned forward, breathless. Dusty, off to the side, watched with a kind of stunned disbelief. He felt naked without his jacket, vulnerable and exposed, but also lighter, as if a long-carried burden was finally being shared. Kane stood beside him, steady and silent, offering silent support with the calm presence of a man who knew what it was to give and to lose. The bids climbed higher. 750, 800. The numbers seemed almost surreal, and Dusty wondered if the room might burst from the sheer force of memory and gratitude. He glanced at the stage, recalling every moment the jacket had shielded him. Rain-soaked patrols, nights spent staring up at foreign stars, days when hope was a threadbare thing, but the jacket still held him together. Roger's voice grew softer, almost reverent, as the auction neared its climax. "Do I hear $850?" The woman with the photograph shook her head, smiling through tears. "That jacket belongs to all of us," she whispered, as if confessing a prayer. A hush settled once more as the bidding paused. Then a voice from the back, a veteran with a cane, rose above the silence. "Let her have it," he said firmly. "Let that story go home." Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. The other bidders lowered their hands, their faces illuminated by a deep, genuine respect. Roger glanced around, his eyes brimming. 800,000, once, twice. He paused, letting the moment settle. Sold. For $800,000 to honor the stories that should never die. The room erupted, not in raucous celebration, but in a powerful, standing ovation. People pressed forward, eager to shake Dusty's hand, to offer thanks, to share in the catharsis that had overtaken the event. For once, it didn't matter how much money was raised, who wore the sharpest suit, or who donated the most. The true value of the night was found in the unity of strangers coming together to witness something honest, a reminder that honor can never be measured by wealth alone. Dusty stood on the stage for a moment, looking out at the sea of faces, each touched by the gravity of what had transpired. The woman who had won the auction approached him slowly, her steps unsteady. She held out the photograph. "This was my father," she said, voice shaking. "He told me that men like you were the reason he came home at all. I want you to know, your jacket will be part of our family's memorial. My children and their children will know your name." Dusty, overwhelmed, could only nod. He took her hand in both of his, rough and scarred against hers, and held it tight. "Thank you," he managed, the words barely a whisper. "That jacket, it's just a piece of cloth. But if it can help someone remember, if it can honor the ones who didn't make it home, then it's worth more than I ever knew." Kane stepped beside him, nodding with pride. "You see," he murmured, "it's not about the jacket. It's about what it stood for. You wore it for all of us." As the applause faded, the energy in the room shifted. The scheduled auction resumed, but the atmosphere was forever changed. Each piece of art sold was accompanied by stories, dedications, and small acts of remembrance. Guests wrote notes for families, contributed to scholarships, and told stories of their own loved ones, laughter and tears mingling in the air, a celebration of the living and the lost. Miranda, the hostess who had once turned Dusty away, approached quietly, offering him a cup of coffee. Her hands still trembled, but her voice was sincere. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Graham," she said, eyes shining with apology and gratitude. "I didn't understand, but I do now." Dusty accepted the coffee, offering a gentle, forgiving smile. "Most people don't," he replied softly. "But now you do, and that's enough." As the night wore on, guests lingered around Dusty and Kane, drawn not by obligation, but by the chance to be close to something genuine. The gala became a mosaic of shared memory, each guest carrying a piece of Dusty's story back into the world. And high above, the stars of Santa Fe blinked down through the glass ceiling, silent witnesses to a night when an old jacket became priceless, and a room full of strangers learned the true meaning of value. For a long moment after the final gavel fell, the only sound in the room was the echo of applause, steady, unwavering, and genuine. The energy in the grand ballroom had changed completely. It was no longer just an art auction or a charity gala, but a living, breathing tribute. As the applause faded into a soft murmur, people began to move, drawn not by duty or expectation, but by a need to connect with the man who had just given up a piece of himself for their understanding. One by one, guests began to form a line in front of Dusty. Some came with hands extended, others simply wanting to look him in the eye and say, "Thank you." There were veterans, some in crisp dress uniforms, others with canes and medals pinned to worn suit jackets, who offered salutes instead of handshakes, their gestures carrying a silent language Dusty understood well. There were women with tear-streaked faces, holding photos of fathers, brothers, sons, each image a testament to lives changed or saved by men like him. A young man, maybe 19 or 20, approached with a cup of coffee, his hands shaking as he offered it. "Here you go, sir," he stammered, voice thick with emotion. "My dad always said the best men he ever knew could drink coffee in a hurricane. He would have wanted me to say thank you, too." Dusty accepted the cup, nodding, the steam rising between them like a bridge across generations. Behind the young man came a woman, Miranda, the hostess, her silver dress shimmering under the lights. Her eyes were red, her mascara smudged, but her head was high. She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "Mr. Graham, I'm so sorry for how I treated you. I didn't know." She hesitated, as if searching for words that could mend the rift her earlier actions had caused. Dusty looked at her, his expression gentle. "Most people don't," he said quietly, "but now you do." Miranda wiped a tear from her cheek and managed a small, grateful smile. As the line continued, stories began to spill out, stories Dusty had never expected to hear. One woman pressed his hands in hers, whispering about her husband lost in the Gulf, saying, "I wish someone like you had been there for him." An older man, his hands marked with the tremor of age, saluted and said, "Welcome home, Sergeant." Others simply stood in silence, their eyes speaking the gratitude their voices couldn't carry. Kane stood nearby, watching with a mix of pride and humility. He saw Dusty's discomfort at first, the way he shrank from attention, but as each guest approached, something inside the old veteran seemed to ease. The burden he'd carried alone for so many years was suddenly shared, piece by piece, word by word, until it felt lighter on his shoulders. Near the edge of the room, the woman who had won the auction waited, her photograph pressed close to her chest. When she finally reached Dusty, she handed him the photo. "That's my dad. He served with you in Nam. I grew up hearing your name. Dusty Graham, the bravest of us all. He's gone now, but I wanted you to know that your story mattered to him, and it matters to me. Thank you for giving me something to pass on to my children." Her voice broke, and Dusty, moved beyond words, drew her into a gentle embrace. People began to linger around Dusty, sharing coffee, stories, and memories, as if reluctant to let the moment end. Some sat at his feet, listening as he recounted tales, not of war, but of friendship, of quiet moments between battles, of laughter in foxholes, of the simple joys that helped them survive. Others brought him small gifts, a hand-drawn portrait, a medal from a local chapter, a folded flag from a young soldier's mother. At one point, the old bartender from earlier, the one who had frowned at Miranda's dismissal, brought over a glass of bourbon. He slid it to Dusty with a wink. "On the house," he whispered, "for courage." Dusty raised the glass, the gesture simple but deeply felt. As the evening deepened, the mood in the ballroom grew warmer, the formality melting away. Strangers became friends, united by the raw humanity of what they had witnessed. Laughter and tears mingled in equal measure. Stories flowed like old songs, and the walls echoed with the kind of joy that comes only from genuine connection. Kane moved through the crowd, pausing to speak with other veterans, sharing his own memories and offering comfort to those who needed it. He noticed how people treated Dusty now, no longer as an outsider or a relic, but as a living bridge between past and present. For the first time in years, Dusty looked at ease, surrounded by people who truly saw him. Miranda, now working the room with a new sense of purpose, quietly ensured that every guest who wished to speak with Dusty had their moment. She brought him a plate of food, making sure he ate between stories, her earlier embarrassment replaced by respect and care. As the night wore on, the line grew shorter, but the impact lingered. The memory of Dusty's humiliation at the door was now a distant echo, replaced by a chorus of gratitude and admiration. The auction had ended, but the real value of the night, shared humanity, compassion, understanding, continued to grow, radiating outward with every handshake, every story, every tear shed in that crowded ballroom. When the last guest finally left, Dusty sat quietly at a table near the window, the city lights of Santa Fe twinkling outside like distant stars. Kane joined him, sliding into the chair across from him. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching the reflection of the chandelier shimmer in their coffee cups. Kane finally spoke, his voice gentle. "You did good tonight, Dusty. You let them see what matters." Dusty nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't do it for them," he said. "I did it for the ones who didn't come home." Kane reached across the table, squeezing Dusty's hand. "That's why you're a hero, whether you like it or not." They sat together, two old soldiers bound by a lifetime of memories, while outside the world moved quietly on, forever changed by a single night and the story of a jacket that became something much greater than cloth and stitches, a symbol of all that endures when strangers become witnesses and witnesses become family. Just when it seemed the night could yield no more surprises, Colonel Kane stood and tapped a spoon gently against his water glass. The gentle ringing called the remaining guests' attention, cutting through the soft hum of stories and laughter. A hush fell once again, and all eyes turned toward Kane and Dusty near the front of the room. Kane cleared his throat. "If you'll indulge me for one more moment, I'd like to offer something special that wasn't part of tonight's program." He nodded at Miranda, who discreetly slipped away through a side door. In her absence, Kane's voice filled the space with a warm, measured authority. "We've honored a great many tonight, but there are always those whose stories stay quiet, who would rather let their actions speak than ever take a bow." He paused, glancing at Dusty. "Sometimes, those are the stories we most need to remember." Miranda returned, wheeling in a large canvas veiled in dark blue velvet. The painting, taller than a man, glimmered beneath the ballroom lights. Kane positioned himself beside it and rested his hand on the cloth. "This is a gift," Kane said softly. "Not just for Sergeant Graham, but for all of us who have ever looked for courage in unexpected places." With a gentle flourish, he pulled the velvet away. The crowd gasped, and even the most stoic guests blinked back tears. The painting showed Dusty, decades younger, sweat-soaked and battered, dragging Colonel Kane from the burning wreckage. Flames and smoke licked the background, but the focus was on Dusty's face, determined, selfless, almost serene, as he carried another man's life through hell. The artist, a veteran herself, had captured every detail: the torn jacket, the mud-streaked skin, the haunted but unbroken look in Dusty's eyes. A hush fell across the ballroom, broken only by the softest exclamations. "That's him!" Unbelievable. He never said a word about it. For a long moment, Dusty couldn't move. He stared at the painting, his lips parted, his breath caught somewhere between pride and grief. He saw not just himself, but all the brothers in arms who'd walked with him through fire, some who'd made it home, others whose names were now etched in stone or remembered in the fading photographs tucked in old wallets. Kane placed a reassuring hand on Dusty's shoulder. "You never asked for recognition," Kane said, his voice trembling slightly, "but I want you and everyone in this room to know that you were never invisible. Even the quietest hero leaves a mark." A wave of applause swept through the room, gentler but deeper than before. It wasn't the applause of an audience. It was the embrace of a family. Dusty stood, shoulders bowed, unsure how to receive so much attention. For so long he'd lived in the background, content to let others have the spotlight. Now, the light shone on him, not for a speech, but for a moment of truth. Miranda stepped forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's beautiful," she whispered, glancing from the painting to the real man standing beside her. "I'm so sorry I ever doubted you." Dusty smiled, a tired, grateful smile. "You did what most people do," he replied quietly. "It's hard to see the stories people carry until you really look." One by one, guests approached the painting. Some traced their fingers along the painted burn scars, marveling at the lifelike detail. A group of young ROTC cadets gathered, staring at Dusty with a reverence usually reserved for legends. The woman who had won the auction lingered longest, touching the canvas as if searching for her father's spirit in the brushstrokes. As Dusty watched the crowd, he was struck by the simple but profound realization that this night and this painting weren't just about him. They were about every Dusty who had ever been overlooked or forgotten. Every silent hero who had quietly done the right thing, expecting nothing in return. Colonel Kane addressed the room once more. "Let this painting be a reminder," he said, "that heroism isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a steady hand in the fire, a quiet voice in the chaos, a willingness to walk back for a brother when everyone else runs away." The guests nodded, some openly crying, others reflecting quietly. Even the most successful, the most powerful, seemed smaller in the face of this truth. An older man with a silver star pinned to his lapel stood up and saluted Dusty. "We don't always get the homecoming we deserve, Sergeant," he said, "but tonight, you got yours." Dusty's voice was rough as gravel as he replied, "It wasn't just me out there. We all carried each other. I was just lucky enough to be seen." The portrait remained at the front of the hall, surrounded by flowers and small mementos, as guests added their own tributes. A pair of dog tags here, a faded photo there, a poem written on the back of a napkin. The painting became more than art. It was a living memorial, a beacon for every guest to recall the cost and the reward of quiet courage. As the applause faded, Dusty stood before the portrait, eyes shining. The ballroom glowed with something that had nothing to do with chandeliers or wealth. A genuine warmth, a connection born from shared stories and a long overdue acknowledgement. Kane joined Dusty at the front, and for a moment neither man spoke. They stood shoulder to shoulder before the painting, two lives forever linked by one night in 1972, and by the long shadow of memory that stretches over every silent hero. Applause began again. Not for performance, not for spectacle, but for recognition. The kind of applause that lets a man know he's truly been seen and that his story, at last, has found its home. As the night drew to a close, the energy in the ballroom gradually shifted from a wave of shared celebration to something gentler, a current of thoughtful, almost sacred calm. The crowd thinned as guests quietly gathered their coats and mementos, their faces marked by the rare peace that comes from witnessing something genuine and important. For a few moments, the echo of laughter and applause lingered, then faded into the hush of late evening. In a quiet corner, away from the lingering clusters of guests, Dusty found himself standing alone in front of a small memorial painting that had caught his eye earlier. It wasn't grand or ostentatious, just a simple canvas. A pair of worn combat boots sitting on sun-bleached sand, a folded flag resting beside them. The details were soft, almost dreamlike, the colors muted, an artist's tribute to the silent goodbyes and the stories that never quite find words. Dusty studied the painting, hands in his pockets, feeling the weight of memory settle gently over him. He saw not just the boots and flag, but the men he'd walked beside in the red mud of Vietnam, the friends whose laughter still echoed in the back of his mind. He remembered the feeling of sand in his boots, the sting of salt in his eyes, and the sound of distant thunder that always seemed to promise more than rain. Behind him, footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate, familiar. Colonel Kane joined Dusty at the memorial, saying nothing at first. They stood side by side, gazing at the painting. There was no need for words between them. In the quiet, their bond was stronger than any speech. They'd shared things most people couldn't imagine. Fear and fire, sorrow and stubborn hope. Victories counted not in medals, but in lives pulled from the jaws of chaos. Kane finally broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a good painting," he said, nodding at the boots and flag. "Says what 1,000 words can't." Dusty's lips quirked in a soft smile. "Reminds me of mornings over there, quiet before the storm, boots lined up, waiting for another day." The two men let the silence return, their gazes fixed on the memorial. Around them, the last of the guests slipped away, leaving only a handful of staff quietly packing up the evening. Miranda drifted past, catching Dusty's eye with a grateful nod before heading out into the Santa Fe night. The pianist closed the lid on the grand piano with a gentle click, and the distant hum of city traffic was the only sound from beyond the glass. Kane looked at Dusty, his expression open, unguarded. "You ever think about those days? About what we left behind?" "All the time," Dusty replied quietly. "Some nights, it's the only thing that keeps me company. Some nights, I'd trade everything to forget." Kane nodded, understanding. "But you showed up tonight? You let them see. That takes guts, old man." Dusty chuckled, a sound weathered by age and years of carrying stories too heavy to share. "I almost didn't come. Thought it'd just be another night of speeches and handshakes. People looking right through me. Well, they saw you tonight. All of us did." They fell into another silence, this one comfortable. Two men with no need to fill the air with empty talk. Dusty reached out and touched the edge of the canvas, fingers tracing the outline of the boots. His voice dropped to a murmur. "You know, I never wanted anything like this. Didn't want to stand out. Didn't want to be the story." Kane smiled, clapping Dusty gently on the back. "Heroes never do." Dusty exhaled slowly, the tension of the evening melting away. "I just did what needed doing, like everyone else who wore those boots." A long pause hung between them. Kane watched Dusty, searching his old friend's face for any hint of regret, but all he found was a quiet acceptance, the peace that comes from being truly seen and understood. After a while, Kane reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn, faded photograph. He handed it to Dusty without a word. The picture showed a group of young soldiers, grinning in the sun, their arms slung around each other. Dusty's younger self stood among them, his face boyish but already marked by resolve. For a moment the years seemed to fall away, and the ghosts of old friends filled the space around them. Dusty ran his thumb over the photo, his vision blurring just a little. "We made it, didn't we?" Kane nodded, against all odds. They stood together, their shoulders almost touching. No further words were needed. The silence was not empty, but full of the things that bind brothers in arms, the knowledge that even in a room of strangers they were never truly alone. After a while, Dusty spoke, his voice almost inaudible. "Glad you made it, soldier." Kane didn't reply, but squeezed Dusty's arm, the gesture saying more than language ever could. Outside, the city lights of Santa Fe glowed, and the desert wind rattled the windows just enough to remind them that the world was still turning, even as their own lives circled back to the same truths, that honor endures in silence, that friendship outlives the years, and that sometimes the bravest thing a man can do is simply show up again and again for those who remember. As the last of the lights dimmed and the staff quietly closed up the hall, Dusty and Kane stood a little longer in front of the memorial painting, just two veterans, side by side, sharing a silence that said everything that ever needed saying. Long after the last guest had left and the echoes of applause had faded, the grand hall stood quiet, washed in the silver light of early morning. The scent of old paper and coffee lingered, mingling with a faint trace of aftershave and flowers left at the base of the portrait. The memorial painting, boots in sand, a folded flag, remained on its easel, the final sentinel of a night that would linger in memory, far longer than anyone had planned. Dusty Graham sat alone for a while, watching the sky outside turn from ink black to the soft gray of dawn. His thoughts wandered, tumbling between past and present, from the chaos of old battlefields to the stillness of this empty room. There had been nights, many of them, when he wondered if the world even remembered men like him, or cared about the burdens they carried in silence. Yet tonight had changed something fundamental. He hadn't come seeking praise, only to pay his respects, to honor those who'd never made it home. But somewhere between humiliation at the door and the standing ovation, he'd seen the ripple his own story could make. He rose slowly, feeling every year in his bones, and wandered over to the portrait. The light coming through the windows painted the canvas in gold, making the painted flames and scars shimmer as if alive. Dusty reached out, fingers trembling, and rested his hand against the edge, quiet, reverent. For a moment he let the weight of loss settle over him, mingled with the strange comfort of being truly seen. From the far end of the hall, Kane appeared. No longer the imposing colonel, just an old friend, tie loosened, medals tucked away. He joined Dusty in front of the painting, and together they stood in silence, shoulder to shoulder, watching the dawn break. Kane broke the hush with a voice low and thoughtful. "You know, I used to think heroism was about big gestures, about medals and parades. But standing here, looking at this, it's clear that sometimes the bravest thing is simply to show up, to stand up for someone when nobody's looking, to carry on quietly, even when the world turns away." Dusty nodded, his voice gravelly but steady. "We never did it for glory. We did it for each other, for the ones who didn't get to come home. I just hope tonight, maybe a few more folks will remember." Kane smiled, a deep warmth in his eyes. "They will. You made sure of it." As the morning grew brighter, the staff returned, gently gathering the last of the decorations. Miranda paused by Dusty and Kane, offering a shy but genuine smile. "Thank you for letting us see," she whispered, "for reminding us what we're really here for." Dusty smiled back. "It's not about being remembered by everyone. It's enough to be remembered by someone." Miranda pressed a hand to her heart, then slipped away, her steps lighter than before. A narrator's voice would echo in this moment, maybe not in the ballroom, but in the hearts of everyone who had been there, and those who would someday hear the story. He didn't ask to be remembered, but someone remembered. And that changed everything. For the rest of the day, and in the days that followed, the story of Dusty Graham, of the jacket, the painting, and the night the Medal of Honor winner saluted the quiet man at the door, spread far beyond the walls of the gala. Photos appeared in newspapers, stories rippled across social media, veterans groups reached out, school children wrote letters, and families gathered to share their own memories of loved ones who had served. Dusty's story wasn't just his anymore. It had become a tapestry, woven from 1,000 voices, each one adding new color and meaning. In the end, the lesson was simple but profound. In a world chasing titles and tuxedos, the real giants walk quietly, in worn jackets and wounded silence. Never judge a man's worth by what he wears, or how loud he speaks. Some have already said enough, on battlefields, with their actions. Their stories are all around us, if we care to look, listen, and remember. As Dusty and Kane stepped outside into the crisp Santa Fe morning, the city was waking up. The streets were empty but full of possibility, the sun rising over the mountains as if promising a new day, a day when the sacrifices of yesterday would not be forgotten. Dusty glanced at Kane, then at the horizon. "Ready to go home?" Kane nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, old friend. I think we've earned it." They walked off together, not as heroes, not as legends, but as two men bound by memory, by duty, and by a friendship that had survived the hardest of storms. Sometimes the most important battles are fought in silence, and the greatest heroes never demand recognition. The next time you see a quiet man or woman in a battered jacket, pause. Consider the stories they carry, the ones they've never told. Offer them a moment, a thank you, a seat at your table. In honoring their quiet courage, we honor all the silent giants who came before them. For more true stories, honoring those who served without needing a spotlight, subscribe, like, and share. Every voice helps carry their legacy forward, and as the story closes, the portrait remains, a reminder that sometimes the bravest things are done in silence, and the loudest echoes come from the softest footsteps.